what makes for a truly flourishing society? I mean, what's the real purpose of government when you boil it down?
Huge questions, and not new ones.
Exactly. How do we even start thinking about organizing ourselves politically so that, it actually benefits everyone? These are the kinds of fundamental questions we're tackling today.
And we're going back quite a way to do it.
We are. We're diving deep into one of the absolute cornerstones of Western political thought, written over 2,000 years ago, Aristotle's Politics.
A foundational text, no doubt about it.
And this isn't just going to be some dusty history lesson. Our whole exploration today is actually fueled by a listener request. Someone sent in a really rich collection of sources, articles, notes, research, because they wanted a thorough but also accessible understanding of Aristotle's core ideas.
That's great. Having specific source material to ground the discussion is fantastic.
Totally. So we're looking at his ideas on the state, the different forms of government, what makes them tick, and fundamentally what it means for a whole community to really thrive politically.
Right.
So our mission here is to unpack Aristotle's approach, which is famously empirical. Very practical, really.
Yeah, he wasn't just dreaming up utopias in thin air.
Not at all. He was looking at actual communities, studying existing constitutions, trying to figure out, based on real evidence, how they worked and how they could work better, how they could be ordered to achieve the highest good for the people living in them.
That empirical lens is so crucial for understanding Aristotle. He wasn't operating in a philosophical vacuum. He really aimed to build a systematic science of politics, much like he did with biology or ethics.
Right, a science based on observation.
Exactly. And that practical observational method really sets him apart from some other thinkers. It's also worth remembering, as the sources you mentioned probably point out, that what we actually have of the politics, well, they seem to be largely teaching notes.
Ah, okay, so maybe a bit dense sometimes.
It can be, yes. But they also offer this incredibly direct window into his thought process, maybe less polished than a finished treatise. It's quite unique. So our tone for this deep dive will aim to reflect that. It will be, scholarly and analytical. We need to dig into the logic, but also practical and insightful. Because the questions Aristotle is wrestling with, governance, citizenship, community, they're still incredibly relevant, sometimes uncomfortably so.
Absolutely.
We'll explore not just what he said, but why he said it, drawing directly from that material you've got.
Okay, let's open the book, metaphorically speaking. Aristotle starts with what he sees as the ultimate human association, the polis, the city-state. Why did he think this was the highest, the most important institution?
Well, his answer really goes back to his view of human nature itself. He defines the state, the polis, as fundamentally an association of associations.
An association of associations.
Okay, meaning it's not some artificial thing imposed from the top down. It's a natural outgrowth of people coming together. The sources really emphasize his famous idea here. Humans are, by nature, political animals. Zoon politikon.
Zoon politikon, political animals. What exactly did he mean by that?
He saw human association developing organically, almost like layers. It starts with the most basic unit, the household, the oikos.
Okay, the family unit.
Right, formed out of necessity. Survival, procreation, daily needs. Then multiple households come together, forming a village. That fulfills slightly broader needs, maybe defense, larger-scale cooperation.
Makes sense.
But it's when you get a collection of villages joining together that you finally reach the polis, the city-state. And the key thing about the polis is that it's the first level of association to achieve self-sufficiency, autarkia.
Self-sufficiency, meaning it can provide everything its members need.
Essentially, yes. Everything necessary for a complete human life, not just survival. And this self-sufficiency is absolutely critical because it allows the state to pursue its ultimate purpose.
Which isn't just about making sure everyone gets fed.
No, it's much higher than that. The ultimate purpose of the state, for Aristotle, is aiming at the highest good. While other associations exist for specific, limited purposes, the household for daily needs, maybe a business partnership for economic gain, the polis exists for the sake of living well, for achieving a good quality of life.
Living well. So, more than just existing.
Exactly. It's the arena where humans can fulfill their highest potential.
Yeah.
And for Aristotle, that involves moral and intellectual development, living a virtuous life. The sources highlight that the state provides the framework for this. Things like education, opportunities to participate in making laws, serving on juries, engaging in political life.
Okay. So the state actively enables this flourishing.
Precisely. This focus on the highest good, on enabling human flourishing, is what makes the state different from and superior to all other forms of human association in his view.
That connects things nicely. The community exists so individuals within it can reach their potential. But let's drill down on that connection. How does actually living in the polis specifically link up with Aristotle's broader ideas about individual happiness, eudaimonia?
Right, eudaimonia. For Aristotle, happiness isn't just, a fleeting feeling of pleasure. It's an activity. Specifically, it's the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue or excellence.
Activity of the soul.
Yeah, meaning using our uniquely human capacity for reason and using it well. And he argues very strongly that this kind of real fulfilling happiness isn't something you achieve in isolation. It's found in social life.
Because we're political animals.
Exactly. Because we are fundamentally social political animals. We need community not just to survive, but to truly flourish, to achieve that eudaimonia.
So the social fabric is essential for individual well-being.
Absolutely. The sources really emphasize this. He even talks about friendship, philia, as being crucial for happiness. He calls it an end in itself. And philia for Aristotle is quite broad. It includes personal friendships, sure, but also the civic bonds, the sense of community, the fellow feeling that holds a polis together.
Like social capital, almost.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
He sees these relationships, these connections, as inherently valuable, maybe even more so than just piling up physical wealth. Though he's practical, he definitely acknowledges that a certain level of property, of resources, is necessary.
Why necessary?
Well, it provides the means to live a virtuous life. You need resources to have the leisure for education, for participation, for philosophical contemplation, for being generous. Property is a tool, accepted as a means to that higher end.
So developing reason, acting virtuously, building social bonds the state is the place where all this happens.
It's the necessary context. It facilitates and allows for the perfection of these activities. There's also this really interesting idea that comes through in the sources. While the city, the polis, exists by nature because of our innate social drive, its actual form, its perfected nature, needs to be shaped by human skill, by craft.
Craft, like political skill.
Exactly. Legislation, politics, statesmanship. Aristotle sees the city almost like, he uses his matter-form distinction, which is central to his whole philosophy.
Hylomorphism, okay.
Right. So the constitution, the politia, is the form. It's the organizing principle, the soul of the city, you could say. It determines the city's structure, its goals, its identity.
And the matter.
The inhabitants, the people, the territory, the resources. They're the matter that the form shapes. The Constitution gives the city its enduring identity over time, much like the form of, say, an oak tree determines what it is, even as its physical matter changes.
That's a powerful image. The Constitution as the city's DNA. Which leads perfectly to the next big question. Who actually gets to be a part of this organism? Who counts as a citizen? Because as you hinted, it wasn't just everyone living there.
No, definitely not. Aristotle's definition of a citizen is much, much narrower than our modern understanding, which is often just based on, where you were born or if your parents were citizens.
So what was his definition?
For Aristotle, a citizen, in the strict sense, is defined as whoever is entitled to share in an office involving deliberation or decision-making.
Deliberation or decision-making, so active participation.
Active participation in the political process. Holding office, serving on juries, attending the assembly. The city, the polis itself, is then defined as the multitude of such persons, these active participants, provided they're numerous enough and have enough resources for a self-sufficient life.
That's restrictive. How did that compare to how people actually thought about citizenship then?
Well, the sources point out it differed even from common usage back then. Often, citizenship was based on having citizen parents, sometimes going back generations. Aristotle saw the logical problem there. It's circular. How do you define the first citizens, the founders of the city, or the Constitution?
Right. Someone had to be the first.
Exactly. He even mentions, apparently, a witty comment from Gorgias of Leontini. Gorgias supposedly quipped that just as mortars are made by mortar makers, Lauresian's people from the city of Larissa are made by craftsmen, because some officials there were called Larissa makers.
A bit cynical.
A bit cynical, maybe, but it highlights Aristotle's point. Genuine citizenship shouldn't just be about lineage or where you happen to be. It has to be defined functionally by participation in the political life in the regime itself.
And this brings us back to the politia, the Constitution. You said it's more than just the government structure.
Much more. It is the fundamental arrangement of offices, how power is distributed, yes, but crucially, it's also the defining way of life of that community. It embodies the city's values, its goals, its character. It's what makes Athens, Athens and Sparta, Sparta. The Constitution is the form that gives the city its identity over time, persisting even as the individual citizens change.
Okay, so if citizenship is about active participation in deliberation and decision, what qualifications did that imply, according to the sources?
Well, the qualifications that emerge are quite demanding and, frankly, exclusionary by our standards. In many of the constitutions Aristotle analyzed, people engaged in what he called vulgar trades were often excluded.
Vulgar trades, what did that cover?
Manual labor, craftsmanship, commerce, farming in some cases. Basically, anyone whose life was primarily focused on working with their hands or just making money for survival.
Why exclude them?
The reasoning, which is central to his argument, is that political action and the cultivation of virtue require leisure. Skull. If you're constantly laboring just to make ends meet, you simply don't have the time, the energy, or the freedom needed for education, for reflection, for participating in the often time-consuming activities of governing and deliberating.
So leisure is a prerequisite for citizenship.
In the ideal or best constitution, yes. This often meant that property ownership was implicitly or sometimes explicitly tied to citizenship. You needed sufficient resources to be free from the necessity of constant labor.
Because those focused only on survival or base work.
Don't fully share in the city's highest purpose, which is the pursuit of virtue and the good life. Remember, for Aristotle, happiness requires virtue, and ideally a happy city is one where all citizens possess this virtue, or at least are capable of it. This view had pretty stark social implications.
Such as?
Well, the sources suggest that in his view of the best city, the necessary work of farming, for instance, might ideally be done by non-citizens, perhaps slaves, or subject peoples specifically to free up the actual citizens for their political and intellectual duties.
Wow. Okay, that's a very different vision of society. So citizenship is demanding, requires participation, leisure, property. But what about the reality? What happens when you have a large group of free people, the multitude, the demos, who don't meet these high standards? They don't have the wealth, maybe not the perceived virtue. Who rules then?
This is a huge practical problem that Aristotle grapples with directly. It's where his pragmatism really comes to the fore.
Yeah.
He absolutely recognizes the danger in just handing over the keys, the highest offices, the main executive or judicial roles solely to the multitude.
Why the danger?
He worries about potential injustice and imprudence. If people who lack the necessary virtue, the education, the experience, hold unchecked power, they might make poor decisions or act unfairly, perhaps out of self-interest or ignorance.
Okay, that's one side of the coin.
But he immediately sees the other side, giving the multitude no share in political power whatsoever. Well, the sources say he found that alarming.
Alarming. Why?
Because a city where a large number of free people who might be poor but are still free are completely shut out of the political process is inherently unstable. You're essentially creating a large group of internal enemies, people with grievances against the regime.
So damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Not quite. His solution, and he draws on the wisdom of earlier legislators like Solon here, is a kind of structured, balanced participation.
How does that work?
The idea is, don't give the multitude the highest individual offices where they rule alone. That's too risky. But do let them participate in deliberating and judging. Let them be part of the assembly. Let them serve on the large popular courts.
So they have a voice, but not ultimate control.
Kind of. The thinking is that while individual members of the multitude might lack perfect judgment or virtue, collectively, when they come together, they possess a kind of cumulative wisdom, an adequate perception. There's wisdom in crowds up to a point.
Interesting. The sum is greater than its parts.
Something like that. And crucially, he suggests that when this collective judgment of the multitude is mixed with the input of those considered better, maybe the more experienced, educated, or virtuous citizens, the overall result benefits the city.
Yeah.
He uses this analogy.
Yeah.
He says sometimes impure food, when mixed with a small amount of pure food, makes the whole batch more useful or nourishing than the small amount of pure stuff on its own.
So blend the different elements.
Right. It's about tempering the potential flaws of any single group, the potential rashness of the multitude, perhaps the potential arrogance of the elite, by creating a system where they have to interact and ideally moderate each other.
That idea of structured participation and mixing elements seems like a perfect lead-in to his famous classification of different types of government. Can you walk us through that framework?
Absolutely. This is probably one of the things Aristotle is most famous for in political thought. He starts by observing, quite empirically, that the reason we see so many different kinds of government, so many different regimes or constitutions, is simply because every city is complex. It's made up of different parts.
Like we discussed, rich, poor.
Exactly. Rich, poor, the middling group, people in different occupations, farmers, artisans, traders, different prominent families, people with varying levels of claimed virtue, and so on. A regime, then, is essentially the specific way a city arranges its political offices. How are those positions of power distributed? It usually depends on who holds the dominant power, the wealthy, the poor, the good men, or on some particular idea of equality or justice that the regime embodies.
Okay, so how does he classify them?
He presents a primary framework of 6 forms. It's organized along 2 axes: how many people rule, one, few, or many, and crucially, whether they rule in the common interest or only in their own self-interest.
Right. The goal of the rulers matters.
It's the fundamental ethical distinction for him. So, first, the correct forms, where the rulers govern with a view to the common good, the benefit of the whole community.
Okay.
1. Kingship. Rule by one outstanding individual, superior in virtue, who rules for the good of all.
The ideal philosopher king, almost.
Potentially, yes, if such a person exists and rules rightly. 2. Aristocracy. Rule by a few, specifically the aristoi, the best people, chosen for their virtue, who rule collectively for the common good.
Rule by the excellent few.
Correct. And 3. Politeria, using the same word as constitution generally, which could be confusing, but here means a specific type. This is rule by the multitude, but, and this is key, organized in a way that still aims at the common good, not just the good of the poor majority.
Okay, those are the 3 correct forms. What about the deviations?
The deviant forms are the corrupt versions that arise when the rulers prioritize their own self-interest over the common good. Each corresponds to one of the correct forms. 1. Tyranny. This is the deviation from kingship. The single ruler governs purely for their own benefit, often through force and oppression.
The classic dictator.
Pretty much. 2. Oligarchy. This is the deviation from aristocracy. It's ruled by a few, but now it's the wealthy few, ruling in their own economic interest, not based on virtue.
Rule by the rich for the rich.
You got it.
Yeah.
And 3. Democracy. This is the deviation from polity. It's ruled by the multitude, specifically the poor majority, but governing primarily in their own interests, potentially at the expense of the wealthy or the common good.
So the key dividing line is?
Motive. Is the government serving the whole community, aiming at the common good? That's correct. Is it serving only the private interests of the rulers, whether one, few, or many? That's deviant.
That's a clear ethical framework. Now, which of these did Aristotle actually think was best?
Well, it's a bit nuanced. In theory, purely theoretically, he often suggests that kingship or aristocracy could be the absolute best forms. If you could actually find one person or a small group of people who were genuinely, demonstrably superior in virtue and wisdom, capable of ruling perfectly for the common good, guiding the city towards the most choice-worthy way of life, then their rule would be ideal.
The big if.
Exactly. In that theoretical best city, he says the virtue of an excellent citizen would be exactly the same as the virtue of an excellent human being. But he's also a realist. He recognizes that finding such paragons of virtue is incredibly rare in practice.
So what's the realistic best option?
He considers the polity, that mixed constitution we talked about, which aims at the common good but involves broader participation, as the best practicable form of government for most actual cities most of the time. It might not reach the theoretical heights of perfect rule by the virtuous, but it's potentially more stable, more achievable, and less prone to corruption than the other forms.
It feels like the difficulty in finding those truly virtuous rulers is what often leads societies towards the more common and often deviant forms, oligarchy and democracy. Let's dig into those two a bit more. They seem especially relevant historically and even now. What did Aristotle see as their core natures and their biggest dangers?
You're absolutely right. He spends a lot of time analyzing oligarchy and democracy precisely because they were, and arguably still are, the most common political realities. Oligarchy fundamentally is ruled by the wealthy. Its very nature is defined by things like property qualifications for holding office and power residing firmly in the hands of a few rich families or individuals.
And its dangers.
The sources highlight several key dangers. The most obvious that the wealthy rule primarily for their own private gain, their own enrichment. This inevitably leads to injustice and exploitation of the non-wealthy majority, especially the poor. Oligarchs also tend to mistrust the multitude.
How does that mistrust manifest?
It can lead to policies designed to keep the poor down. Things like depriving ordinary citizens of weapons, deliberately mistreating them, or even dispersing groups that seem threatening to the oligarch's power.
Sounds like a recipe for instability.
Exactly. Oligarchies are inherently prone to revolution, or stasis, as Aristotle called it. This instability can come from the oppressed multitude rising up due to injustice. But interestingly, it can also come from within the oligarchy itself.
Factions among the rich.
Precisely. Maybe some wealthy families are excluded from the inner circle of power and become resentful. The sources mention examples like Massilia or Canidas, where specific rules about which families could hold office or limits on terms led to infighting among the elites. Or sometimes, powerful individuals within the oligarchy simply clash with each other, weakening the regime and making it vulnerable to challenges from below or from rival elites.
Okay, so oligarchy is unstable due to exclusion and internal rivalries. What about democracy? Rule by the people, the multitude.
Democracy's fundamental principle, as the sources describe it, often revolves around ideas of freedom and equality, particularly numerical equality, one person, one vote sort of thing.
Yeah.
But its deviant form, especially what Aristotle saw as radical democracy, carries its own significant dangers.
Such as?
He warns quite strongly about the potential for mob rule. When the sheer number of the multitude holds ultimate authority, especially when they can override established laws through simple majority decrees in the assembly, reasoned deliberation can get swamped by emotion and short-term passions.
The tyranny of the majority.
In effect, yes. And this kind of environment, he argues, is fertile ground for demagogues.
Demagogues. Popular leaders who whip up the crowd.
Exactly. Leaders who gain power by flattering the people, appealing to their base desires, and often by slandering the notables, the wealthier or more established citizens. Aristotle saw a real danger that these demagogues could manipulate the democracy and eventually establish themselves as tyrants, using popular support to seize personal power. He also worried that radical democracy pushes for an excessive, purely numerical equality that ignores differences in merit, contribution, or virtue, leading to a leveling down effect.
Did he see all democracies as equally bad?
No, not at all. The sources show he distinguished between different kinds of democracy, and he actually considered the farming type of democracy to be the best, or at least the most stable and moderate.
Farming democracy. Why was that better?
His reasoning was quite practical. Farmers are busy people. They're tied to their land, their work is demanding. This means they generally lack the leisure time for constant political agitation or hanging around the city assembly.
They've got other things to do.
Right. He also thought their work was often more intrinsically satisfying than the endless wrangling of politics. And crucially, because they owned and worked their own property, they didn't tend to covet the property of others in the same way an urban poor population might. They just wanted to be left alone to farm.
So, less likely to cause trouble.
Less likely to be swayed by demagogues or push for radical redistribution. Their political ambition might be satisfied simply by having the power to elect officials and, importantly, to hold them accountable through audits, euthunai, without necessarily wanting to hold all the offices themselves. The example of Mantinea is mentioned in the sources, where the people apparently had authority and deliberation but didn't dominate all the magistracies. This type of democracy, grounded in a productive, dispersed, less politically agitated population, seemed far preferable to him than one centered on a large, potentially idle, urban multitude dependent on state pay for participation.
And this contrast seems to lead back to the polity again, the best practicable option.
Exactly. The polity was seen as the best practicable form, precisely because it tries to mitigate the dangers of both pure oligarchy and pure democracy by blending elements from each. The goal is stability through achieving a mean, a balance.
How does that blending work?
A well-mixed polity, Aristotle suggests, is one that's so finely balanced you could plausibly describe it as either a democracy or an oligarchy, depending on which features you emphasize. That indicates a successful mixture where neither element completely dominates.
Any examples?
Sparta is often brought up in the sources as a regime that seemed to achieve this kind of mix, at least in Aristotle's analysis. It had democratic elements like the common upbringing of children, the shared public meals, syssitia, and the fact that crucial officials like the ephors, overseers, and the Gerousia, council of elders, were elected by the people.
But also oligarchic element.
Yes. Offices were filled by election, which tends to favor notables, rather than by lot, which was seen as more democratic. And very serious judicial cases, like those involving death or exile, were judged by only a small number of officials. So a blend of popular participation and elite control.
And the benefit of this mix?
Stability, deriving from consent. In Aristotle's view, the great virtue of a well-mixed polity is that its stability comes from within. No single part of the city, not the rich, not the poor, not the middling group, feels so alienated or oppressed, or so overwhelmingly powerful that it strongly desires to overthrow the existing system and replace it with a completely different one. Each major group finds enough of its interests or principles reflected in the Constitution to accept it.
So stability is the watchword, achieved through this careful constitutional engineering, this blending and balancing. How do core principles like justice and the rule of law support this?
Justice is absolutely fundamental for Aristotle. It's not just an abstract ideal, it's the bedrock of political community and stability. He connects it very closely to concepts of equality and, importantly, proportionality.
Proportionality meaning?
Meaning that people should receive benefits or burdens, honors or offices in proportion to their merit, their contribution, or their virtue, depending on the context. Simple numerical equality isn't always just. Injustice, especially a perceived lack of this proportionality, people feeling they aren't getting what they deserve relative to others, is identified as a primary driver of stasis, of factional conflict and revolution. If significant groups feel the system is fundamentally unfair, it breeds resentment that can tear the city apart.
And the rule of law, how does that fit in?
Aristotle makes a very strong case for the superiority of the rule of law over the rule of individuals, even potentially good individuals. His famous line is that law is reason without passion.
Reason without passion.
Yes. Individual rulers, no matter how wise or virtuous they might seem, are still human. They're subject to emotions, biases, personal interests, errors, and judgment. Law, on the other hand, ideally represents the accumulated wisdom, the reasoned deliberation of the community over time, applied impartially. That's why the sources emphasize that the concept of public law became so central to political science following Aristotle. Law provides clear, stable, predictable prescriptions that guide actions and shape behavior. This is especially vital in practical sciences like politics and ethics, where consistent guidance is needed.
So law isn't just about preventing crime.
No, its role is much deeper. It's crucial for shaping virtuous citizens. By setting standards and encouraging good habits, law helps cultivate the character needed for a flourishing community. And of course, it's essential for maintaining political stability in the long run. The very preservation of the city, Aristotle argues, lies fundamentally in its laws and the respect people have for them.
Which puts a lot of pressure on the lawmaker, the legislator.
Immense pressure. It's an incredibly demanding role. Legislators need profound knowledge. They have to understand not just abstract principles, but the different kinds of regimes, which type of constitution is likely to work best for which specific type of city and population, considering factors like geography, economy, culture. And maybe most importantly, they need to understand what tends to destroy each type of regime, the internal and external threats, so they can build in safeguards. The laws are the practical embodiment of the Constitution, the primary tool for steering the community's way of life towards the common good and ensuring its survival.
Okay, given that emphasis on stability and the dangers of stasis, let's look more closely at the flip side. Why do states fail? What did Aristotle identify as the main reasons for political instability and revolution?
He dedicated a whole book, Book 5 of the Politics, specifically to analyzing revolution and its causes, which shows how important he thought this practical issue was. The sources make it clear that the universal underlying cause of factional conflict, the tension present in almost any regime, is some form of inequality.
Inequality again.
Yes, but specifically, it's inequality perceived as unjust, where there isn't a proper proportion between people who are unequal in some relevant way, like wealth, virtue, or birth. He even points out that something seemingly stable, like a permanent kingship, inherently involves inequality among those who might consider themselves equals, potentially breeding resentment.
So perceived unfairness is the root.
It's the universal root. Beyond that, he identifies more specific triggers that often spark conflict. The desire for material gain and the desire for honor or recognition are incredibly powerful motivators. Individuals and groups will fight to get more wealth or more status, sometimes trying to overthrow the existing system to achieve it.
Gain and honor. What else?
Another major cause he points to is the arrogance, the insolence, the hybris of rulers.
Hybris, like excessive pride.
Excessive pride leading to insulting, demeaning, or unjustly treating subjects, or even other powerful figures. The sources mention examples where attacks on monarchs were directly triggered by such arrogant or insulting behavior. Small slights or injustices committed by those in power can easily snowball into widespread discontent and open rebellion. Fear is another cause. One group fearing what another might do, and sometimes contempt one group despising another and thinking they can easily seize power.
He also looked at how regimes actually change, right? It's not always a total collapse.
Exactly. Revolution doesn't always mean going from, say, oligarchy to democracy overnight. Sometimes a regime gradually transforms into another type. A moderate democracy might become more radical, or decay into an oligarchy, or even slide into tyranny.
Or the goal isn't total change.
Right. Other times, factions aren't trying to abolish the existing system entirely, but simply want to seize control of it for themselves. This is common in oligarchies, where different factions of the rich might fight for dominance, or even in monarchies where powerful nobles might vie for influence over the king. And change can also be more limited, modifying just parts of the Constitution, like establishing a new council, abolishing an old office, or changing election rules. The sources give examples like attempts to abolish the kingship in Sparta or change the power of certain magistracies in other cities, showing these smaller shifts can significantly alter the balance of power.
Given all these causes and types of change, did he offer practical advice on how to actually prevent revolutions and keep governments stable?
Yes, very much so. His advice is remarkably practical and often tailored to the specific vulnerabilities of different regime types. For oligarchies, for example, which he saw as inherently unstable because they exclude the poor majority, he suggests several preventative measures.
Like what?
Things like, the ruling oligarchs should genuinely take care of the poor, not just exploit them. They should try to distribute some gainful offices to poorer citizens. Maybe less powerful roles, but ones that provide an income and a stake in the system. They should punish wealthy individuals who mistreat the poor more severely than if they harm someone from their own class, showing fairness.
Interesting. What about property?
He suggests measures to prevent excessive concentration of wealth, which fuels oligarchic tendencies and resentment. Regulating inheritance, for instance, maybe limiting inheritance by family rather than allowing completely free bequest, or restricting property transfers so that estates don't constantly combine, aiming to make property distribution more equitable over time and allow some poor families to potentially rise.
What about mixing power?
In both democracies and oligarchies, he advises a balancing act. Give some form of equality or even precedence in certain matters, perhaps honors or secondary roles, to the group that has the least share in the core constitution. So, give some recognition to the rich in a democracy and some to the poor in an oligarchy. But crucially, keep the most important offices, the ones that truly control the direction of the Constitution, firmly within the hands of the group defined by that Constitution, the multitude in democracy, the wealthy in oligarchy. It's about managing tensions, preventing extreme exclusion, and giving everyone some reason to support the status quo.
It all comes back to balance and avoiding extremes.
Absolutely. And this intense focus on political stability, on the messy realities of preventing conflict and decay, really underscores his empirical approach. It stands in contrast to Plato's more idealistic focus in the Republic. The sources note that Aristotle explicitly critiques Plato, along with other theorists like Hippodamus and Phaleas, arguing that their grand designs for ideal states didn't pay enough attention to these crucial practical challenges of how to actually maintain stability and prevent revolution in the real world.
So preventing collapse is crucial, but what about actively building a state that fosters good citizens and ensures long-term well-being? You mentioned education earlier. That seems key here.
It's absolutely central to his positive vision. For Aristotle, education isn't just a private matter or a parental responsibility. It's a fundamental political necessity, and therefore it should be public and controlled by the state.
Why state-controlled?
His logic flows directly from his view of the state's purpose. The goal is the good life, which requires virtue. The virtue of an excellent citizen, especially one capable of ruling well, is ultimately the same as the virtue of an excellent human being. And how do people become good? Not just by chance. They become good through practice, through habituation, guided by reason and law. Education is the primary means by which the state instills these habits and cultivates this virtue. Therefore, the legislator, whose main concern is the virtue of the citizens and the overall health of the polis, must make education a primary public concern, ensuring it's consistent and aimed at the common good.
What kind of education did he have in mind?
He generally advocated for a system based on the traditional Greek curriculum of his time. The sources mentioned the core subjects were typically reading and writing, athletics or gymnastics, music, and sometimes drawing or painting.
Did each have a specific purpose?
Yes. Reading, writing, and drawing were seen as useful for the practicalities of life, for business, household management, and so on. Athletics was important for developing courage, discipline, and physical fitness, necessary for military service and general well-being.
And music. That seems less obviously practical.
Music is where he gets particularly philosophical and detailed, as the sources really show. He acknowledges that for many people, music might just seem like entertainment, a source of pleasure. But he argues its original and most important place in education was much deeper than that. It relates to the proper use of leisure, skull.
Leisure again.
Yes. Nature itself, he believes, seeks not only necessary activity, but also the capacity to be at leisure nobly, in a fulfilling way. Music, he argues, contributes profoundly to the development of character and the soul, making it essential for that noble leisure. He even cites the example of specific musical modes or tunes like those associated with Olympus, which were believed to directly inspire souls and evoke powerful emotions like enthusiasm. This demonstrates for him how music can imitate and influence states of character.
So listening to music actually shapes you.
That's his core argument. He makes the crucial point that when we listen to musical imitations, melodies, and rhythms that represent certain emotions or characters, we actually experience similar passions ourselves. Our souls are moved, altered by the music.
Okay.
And since music provides a natural pleasure, and virtue itself is partly about learning to find pleasure in the right things, in noble actions and characters, well, learning to correctly judge and enjoy musical representations of good character and noble actions becomes a vital part of moral education. It trains our emotions.
How direct is this connection between music and character?
He argues it's remarkably direct. He claims that rhythms and tunes possess actual likenesses, very close resemblances, to the genuine nature of various character traits: anger, gentleness, courage, moderation, and their opposites. He says you can see the proof because our souls are visibly altered when we listen to different kinds of music.
More so than with other arts.
Yes, he contrasts it with the visual arts. While figures or colors in paintings might offer indications or signs of character, they don't have the same immediate visceral likeness to the states of the soul that music does. He even apparently recommended studying paintings by artists known for depicting character well, like Polygnotus, rather than those like Poussin who focused less on it.
So music education is really about emotional and moral training.
Exactly. It's about habituation. By repeatedly experiencing the appropriate feelings, pleasure at noble melodies, perhaps aversion to vulgar ones through music, we habituate our souls to respond correctly to virtue and vice in real life. It's a way of aligning our feelings with reason, preparing citizens for a good life, both in action and in noble leisure.
So the state shapes the citizen through law, education cultivates virtue, but Aristotle also drilled down even further to the most basic unit, the household, the oikos. How did he see household management fitting into the political picture, including its economic side?
The household, the oikos, is absolutely foundational. It's the necessary starting point, the natural origin from which the village and then the polis emerge. It's also the first place where individuals learn about rule and relationships of authority and subordination.
Master-slave, husband-wife.
Exactly. Master and slave, husband and wife, parent and child. Aristotle analyzes these relationships within the household and often uses them as analogies when discussing different forms of political rule in the polis, though he's usually careful to distinguish household management, oikonomia, which often aims at the good of the ruler or the specific needs of the household, from political rule proper, which ideally involves ruling and being ruled in turn among equals for the common good.
What about the economics of the household? Property, wealth?
He definitely explores property and wealth acquisition, seeing property itself as necessary an instrument of action required for living a good life. But he makes a really important distinction, highlighted in the sources, between two kinds of acquisition, two kinds of crematistic or money-making.
Natural versus
unnatural. Natural wealth acquisition is essentially part of household management. It's focused on obtaining the goods necessary for life and for the household's self-sufficiency: food, shelter, clothing, tools. He connects this to what he saw as natural ways of life based on subsistence: the nomad living off livestock, the farmer off crops, even the brigand or hunter or fisher obtaining resources directly from nature. This includes nature providing plants for animals and animals for humans, tame ones for use in food, wild ones for food, and materials like clothing. That's all natural acquisition.
and the unnatural kind.
The unnatural form is acquisition through exchange and commerce, particularly retail trade, where the primary goal isn't obtaining goods for use, but simply accumulating money, currency, for its own sake. This kind of acquisition, he argues, is potentially limitless and becomes detached from the natural needs of life. It risks making wealth an end in itself, rather than just a means to living well, which he saw as a perversion.
That distinction leads us towards some of his most difficult and controversial views, doesn't it? Particularly on slavery.
Yes, it does. His views on slavery are deeply problematic from any modern standpoint, but it's important to understand his argument as presented in the sources. He defends the concept of natural slavery.
Natural slavery.
He argues that some humans are born with a sort of natural deficiency in their rational faculty. They can understand reason in others, but don't possess full deliberative reason themselves. These individuals, he claims, are naturally suited to be ruled by those who do possess full reason, just as the body is naturally ruled by the soul, or animals by humans.
So it's based on inherent capabilities.
That's his claim. And he argues, crucially, that this natural slavery is just and mutually advantageous only when it truly reflects this natural difference and serves the interests of both the slave, who benefits from the master's guidance, and the master who benefits from the slave's labor.
But he distinguished this from other kinds of slavery.
Yes, very importantly, he explicitly distinguishes this natural slavery from what he calls legal or conventional slavery. This refers to people enslaved simply through force of law or custom, like prisoners of war. He acknowledges that these individuals might be intelligent, virtuous, and in no way naturally suited to be slaves. They might even be superior to their masters in some cases. Such conventional slavery based merely on force or law, he argues, is not necessarily just because it's not grounded in that supposed natural hierarchy.
Does he elaborate on the natural slave's capacity?
He suggests there are varying degrees, but generally they lack the fully developed deliberative part of the soul. However, they can perceive and follow the reasoning of others, implying they're capable of understanding instructions and potentially some level of training, perhaps like training animals that possess imagination. He even, surprisingly perhaps, leaves open the possibility of a certain kind of limited friendship, philia, between a master and a natural slave, recognizing the slave's humanity at some level, insofar as the relationship is based on that natural hierarchy and mutual benefit. It's complex, and obviously deeply troubling, but his attempt was to create a philosophical justification distinct from mere power or convention.
What about his views on women, as mentioned in the sources?
The sources consistently indicate his view that within the household structure, the male naturally rules over the female. This fits his broader hierarchical view of nature. His critique of Plato's radical ideas in the Republic about making women and children communal is also significant here. He argues against it, partly on practical grounds, questioning how households could even function if women have the same pursuits as men, and property remains private. He also finds Plato's analogy comparing women pursuing male roles to female animals sharing tasks with males odd, precisely because animals don't have household management in the human sense, which for Aristotle was inherently structured by gender roles.
Does he comment on other social practices?
The sources mention a few specific, sometimes jarring, details. He discusses, apparently without strong judgment either way, the Cretan practice of segregating women to limit births, seeing it as a population control measure. He also seems to defer judgment on the common Greek practice of sexual relations between men. And then you get these almost strangely specific, practical pieces of advice, apparently drawn from doctors and natural scientists of his day, about the ideal marriage ages, women around 18, men around 37, and even the best season, winter, for conception. It shows how he integrated different kinds of contemporary knowledge into his political analysis.
And his overall critique of Plato's communal ideas.
That's a major theme. Aristotle fundamentally disagreed with Plato's proposal in the Republic to abolish private property and the private family among the guardian class. He didn't think communal ownership would solve the city's problems.
Why not?
He argued, very pragmatically, that the real source of evils in cities isn't private property. It's human vice, wickedness, greed, ambition. Making property communal, he predicted, wouldn't eliminate conflict, it would likely increase it, leading to constant quarrels over resources and neglect, because people tend to care more for what is their own. While the idea of total communal living might sound attractive, promising unity and friendship, Aristotle ultimately viewed it as contrary to human nature, practically impossible to implement, and ultimately destructive of the very bonds and responsibilities that hold society together. For him, the path to a better city lay in cultivating virtue and properly regulating existing structures like private property and the family, not in abolishing them.
This has really been an incredibly thorough journey. We've covered so much ground: the nature of the state, citizenship, constitutions, stability, justice, law, education, the household, all through Aristotle's lens in the Politics. As we bring this deep dive towards a close, what stands out as his most enduring contributions? How does this ancient text still speak to us today?
Well, his legacy in political theory is just immense, isn't it? His classification of constitutions, kingship, aristocracy, polity, and their deviations provided a fundamental framework for political analysis that dominated Western thought for well over 2,000 years. It's still a starting point for discussion.
What else?
His concept of the rule of law, that powerful idea of law as reason without passion, being superior to the arbitrary rule of individuals, that remains an absolute cornerstone of modern constitutionalism and democratic theory. His emphasis on balance, on moderation, on stability, particularly embodied in his idea of the mixed constitution, the polity, as the best practical regime, offers timeless wisdom about the challenges of governing diverse societies and avoiding destructive political extremes.
And his overall method.
Fundamentally, his empirical approach, his insistence on actually studying political phenomena, observing how real constitutions work or failed, and grounding his theories in that observation and evidence, that set a standard for the practical analytical study of politics that continues to be profoundly influential.
How does that empirical focus really set him apart from, say, Plato?
It's perhaps the key contrast. While Plato, especially in the Republic, often seems to be constructing an ideal state primarily to illustrate deeper philosophical truths about justice or the soul, Aristotle is much more grounded in analyzing the political realities he saw around him in the Greek world. He's deeply concerned with understanding how actual states function, what makes them stable or unstable, and how they can be incrementally improved, rather than just outlining a perfect, perhaps unattainable blueprint.
So, Plato the idealist, Aristotle the pragmatist.
That's often the shorthand, and there's truth to it. It's why, as the sources hinted, Plato's work, centuries later, was sometimes interpreted or misinterpreted as potentially inspiring utopian or even totalitarian projects, whereas Aristotle's politics was more consistently seen as offering a kind of naturalistic description of political life, analyzing its inherent dynamics, possibilities, and limitations.
And its relevance today, does it still inform contemporary debates?
Absolutely. His work continues to resonate because the fundamental questions he grappled with are, in many ways, our questions too. What is the purpose of political community? Who deserves to be a citizen? And what responsibilities does citizenship entail? How should power be distributed fairly and effectively? How can we create stable, just societies that allow individuals to flourish? How do different forms of government actually behave in practice, and what are their inherent dangers?
The same basic dilemmas.
Pretty much. His rigorous method, his careful definitions, his blend of empirical observation and philosophical analysis, and his practical insights into political behavior and institutional design mean the Politics remains a vital text. It's essential reading for anyone trying to understand the foundations of constitutionalism, the challenges of citizenship, or the ongoing pursuit of the common good in any era. The basic subject matter he defined, the classifications he established, these are still points of departure and often points of vigorous debate in political science today, precisely because these questions remain so complex and contested.
What an incredible exploration into the very foundations of how we think about politics and society. We've really unpacked Aristotle's vision, the state growing naturally from human needs, his demanding view of citizenship, the famous 6 forms of government and their pitfalls, the crucial role he saw for law and stability, the necessity of public education for cultivating virtue, and even the dynamics within the basic household unit. All drawn from his politics and the excellent material you, our listener, provided.
It really is clear, isn't it? Aristotle offers so much more than just historical curiosity. He provides a powerful, enduring framework for thinking critically about the perennial challenges and the highest possibilities of our collective life, always trying to connect that empirical observation with deeper philosophical understanding.
And truly, thank you again to the listener who shared the sources that made this particular deep dive possible. We couldn't have done it without that foundation.
As a final thought for you to perhaps ponder,
Yeah.
drawing from Aristotle's own reflections, he argued quite forcefully that a flourishing political life, the kind involving active deliberation and the cultivation of virtue, requires citizens to have leisure to be free, to some extent, from the constant demands of manual labor or purely commercial activity, which he saw as potentially hindering full citizenship in the best state.
Right, the need for skull.
Exactly. So consider this. What does this ancient perspective, this linkage between leisure, virtue, and meaningful political participation imply for us today? What does it suggest about the conditions for robust citizenship and a healthy community in our own incredibly busy, complex, often work-dominated modern world? Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. Until the next deep dive.